It started with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that holds secrets. Somewhere in the far edge of our galaxy, a star still burns. Dim, tired, but holding within it a memory so powerful, it never truly died. This is not just the story of a star. It's the story of what it lost, of what it consumed, billions of years ago. That same star was alive in a way we rarely imagine. Young, radiant, surrounded by orbiting worlds. Among them, one planet moved closer than the rest. Day after day, it traced a perfect path around its sun, warmed by its light, protected by its distance. For ages, nothing changed, until it did, because stars grow, they evolve, and eventually, they demand everything back. When the star expanded, swollen with age and heat, the planet could do nothing. It didn't fight, it didn't run, it simply drifted closer and closer, until the moment came. One last orbit, one last breath, and then it was gone, swallowed whole by the very force that once gave it life. But the star never forgot. That planet, its shape, its presence, its silence, still lives within every flicker of its fading glow. You're not just here to listen, you're here to witness what stars remember. Long after everything else is gone, so breathe in, let the noise of Earth fade, and listen closely. Because tonight, we step inside a story that began before history. A story about heat, loss, memory, and the star that ate its own world. In the far reaches of space, where time has no clock and silence hums like a distant breath, something ancient began to stir. It was not loud, it was not sudden. It was a slow tension, building deep inside a cold cloud of dust and gas, a nebula, floating in stillness, waiting to become something more. This place had no name. No eyes had seen it. But within its folds, pressure gathered. Gravity, invisible and patient, reached through the darkness like fingers threading stars from emptiness. The gas shivered, dust twisted. Inside that cloud, the quiet was breaking. The chaos wasn't violent, it was soft, like a deep inhale before the first cry. Tiny particles collided, invisible forces collided, and somewhere within that growing storm, heat began to rise. Not just warmth, but a furious glow forming at the center of the swirl. It was subtle at first, like a blush beneath the surface. Then it burned brighter, hotter, until that single point could no longer hold itself in, and then it happened. Light. A pulse tore through the darkness, pure, radiant, alive. A newborn star had ignited. It didn't roar, it simply arrived. One moment, there was nothing. The next, there was fire. For the first time in its existence, the nebula was no longer just a cloud. It had a center now, a heart, a sun. It had given birth to a star. The star didn't know what it was. It didn't have thoughts or fear or memory, only light. It burned because it was born to burn. Its glow reached outward in every direction, touching the inner walls of the nebula like fingers seeking shape. That light was young, wild, and full of potential. It had no past, only future. No story, only possibility. Around it, the remnants of the nebula continued to churn. Gases twisted into spirals. Dust clumped into ribbons. The star's gravity reached outward, commanding everything nearby to dance. It pulled matter toward itself, not to destroy it, but to shape it. In time, this chaos would become order. Rings, disks, planets. But not yet. For now, there was only one truth. The light had arrived. It was small, by stellar standards. Not a giant, not a monster. It would not live forever. But in this moment, it was everything, the heart of a system that hadn't yet formed. The silent witness to a future it couldn't predict. The star pulsed with steady rhythm. Its surface flickered with waves of energy. Its body, made of hydrogen and fire, breathed in silence. And as it spun slowly in place, something began to happen around it. The light was changing its environment. Near the center of the disk, fragments of rock began to cluster. Dust grains collided and stuck. Small clumps became larger ones. Everything around the star started to organize, like iron filings drawn to a magnet. The star, without knowing, had become a creator. But it was still so young, it had no awareness of the lives it might touch, no sense of what its gravity would shape. It simply existed, throwing light into the void and pulling matter into motion. What began as chaos was becoming rhythm, and yet, in all this movement, the star remained unaware of what it had started. It didn't know that one of the tiny clumps orbiting its light would one day form into a planet, that this planet would fall into a perfect path, warmed just enough to survive, yet close enough to be changed. The star knew nothing of the future, and it did not care. It was not meant to. It shined. That was all. From afar, the nebula began to thin. The leftover gas was either swallowed by the star or swept away by its solar winds. The one-stick cloud became a thinner veil, and the shape of a system began to reveal itself. Circles formed around the newborn sun, trails of rock, gas, and promise. Every particle had a new master now, gravity. The star spun faster now, not from fear or excitement, but from physics. Rotation, mass, magnetism, these things gave it structure. These things gave it power. Every moment it burned, it transformed matter into energy. It lived by fusion, by force, by pressure. It was a machine without gears, a fire without wood. It was life, without being alive. And yet, there was something almost emotional in the way it lit up the dark. Something beautiful in its rhythm, its heat, its golden defiance against the cold around it. As if, somehow, the universe had decided this was the moment it would speak, and it spoke through fire. Over the next millions of years, though to a star, time means nothing, its light continued to pour outward. That light traveled through the forming rings, bathing every object in its reach. Some of those objects shattered, others merged, and eventually, the swirling dust gave birth to a handful of newborn planets. They were small, uneven, unfinished, but they were real, and they began to orbit, tracing the shape of a system. Among them was one that formed closer than the others. A rocky body, still glowing from its own heat, wrapped in thin air and turning slowly beneath the sun. This planet didn't yet have oceans. It didn't yet have balance, but it was stubborn. It held its orbit. It didn't drift away. It clung to the gravity of the star, like a child refusing to let go of a parent's hand. The star, of course, didn't notice. It gave its light to all, without favoritism. It warmed whatever turned beneath it, but that planet would stay. That closeness would matter. For now there was no emotion between them, only motion. The star burned, the planet spun, and somewhere deep in that rhythm, something beautiful was beginning. The birth of a system is not a single moment. It is a long, slow unfolding like a dream unrolling in space. The star continued to glow. The planets continued to find their paths, and silence returned, not as emptiness, but as calm. The nebula was gone now. The dust had settled. What remained was a young star, wrapped in rings of orbiting matter, like a king surrounded by silent courtiers. And in that court, one world danced closer than the rest. The star knew none of this. It did not dream. It did not hope. But somewhere deep inside its glowing heart, something new had begun. A pattern, a rhythm, a story. And stories, even in space, always begin with light. As the young star continued to shine, its warmth spread through the vast disk of matter spinning around it. What once was chaos, clouds of dust, gas, ice, and rock, had now begun to settle into form. The wildness of birth was fading. In its place came pattern, direction, and orbit. The star's light carved paths through the dark. Around it, gravity sculpted rings of motion. trails of debris spiraling like dancers around a flame. It was no longer a cloud of randomness. It was a system now, and it was alive in its own strange, silent way. Within these encircling bands of rock and dust, pieces began to meet. Some clashed and shattered, others collided and fused. Slowly, the disk gave rise to shape. Small worlds were born, heavy spheres of stone, spinning rapidly, pulled together from the dust left behind by the star's ignition. Each one was different. Some remained small and cold, clinging to the outer edges. Others grew large, cloaked in thick gas, drifting farther out into colder orbits. But one world, one single planet, stood apart. It was not the largest, not the brightest, but it was the closest. Tucked near the star, inside the golden zone of warmth, where ice could melt and matter could stir, this planet began to take shape with quiet determination. At first, it was just a jagged rock, glowing faintly from the heat of its own assembly. It had no oceans, no skies, only stone and silence. But it held its place. While other newborn planets wobbled, drifted, or collided into ruin, this one remained. It locked into a steady orbit, not too close to be burned, not too far to be forgotten. A narrow, perfect path. The star gave it light without knowing. Its gravity held it steady. Its heat touched the surface. And over time, that heat became transformation. Volcanoes bled across the crust, reshaping the surface with molten scars. Atmospheres formed and changed, stirred by the pressure of a spinning core. Storms rose and fell. The planet cooled, then warmed, then balanced. Slowly, rhythm replaced violence, and still, it remained, orbiting in perfect cadence, spinning like a whispered secret, just beneath the star's gaze. This planet was different. It didn't just orbit, it responded. Its surface began to soften. Gases rose and settled. Thin clouds stretched across its sky. Light reflected off its turning face like breath on glass. The planet was not conscious, but it behaved like something alive. Not in action, but in presence. It received light. It held warmth. It turned without resistance, and the star, though it had no mind, no choice, gave more to this world than to any other. Its rays touched the planet with steady patience. Day after day, year after year, the same rhythm played. Light, shadow, light again. The star nourished the planet in silence, not with intention, but with consistency. And the planet accepted, turning over and over, exposing each side to the gift. A bond was forming, not a spoken one, nor one of emotion, but of pattern, of trust, of time. Other planets came and went. Some stayed at the far edges, others collided and disappeared, but this one held firm. It was close, stable, and warmed by the perfect amount of light. The star became its anchor, and the planet, in return, became the closest echo of the star's presence. They were locked now, not in communication, but in harmony. The star pulsed, and the planet felt it. Solar winds brushed against its upper atmosphere, stirring gentle tides of energy. The magnetic field around the planet responded like a drumskin touched by a breeze. The connection deepened. Over time, the surface of the planet began to change. Rock shifted into land. Land broke and rose into mountain ranges. Basins formed. Storms shaped valleys. And above it all, a thin sky held it close. Molecules moved. Particles danced. The planet began to breathe, slowly, subtly, but unmistakably. This world was alive, not in biology, not yet, but in energy, in motion, in rhythm. It was responsive, dynamic, constantly reacting to the light that reached it every moment of its spin. And still, the star burned on. Its light did not flicker. Its rhythm did not break. Every rotation, the planet revealed its face once more, turning its surface to the warmth, like a child seeking comfort in familiar arms. It was a relationship without speech, without knowledge, but not without meaning. In the silence between them, a universe was forming. As the system matured, the other planets settled into their own distant paths. Some grew massive, wrapped in swirling storms of gas. Others remained small, frozen in place, locked in slow isolation. But none shared the intimacy of that one inner world. It was here, in this narrow band of orbit, that something rare had begun. The planet was no longer just reacting, it was adapting. Winds shaped dunes, water drawn from deep inside, pooled and evaporated. Cycles formed, feedback loops danced, and with time, the surface began to soften in unexpected ways. Valleys cradled warmth, light touched the ground and stayed longer. Heat spread, stored, and returned, and still, the star remained, unchanged. It did not know. It did not need to. Its purpose, unknowingly fulfilled, was to nourish, to give, to maintain the delicate equilibrium that allowed the world below to continue turning. There was no promise made between them, no contract signed in light, but the bond was there, undeniable, unspoken, eternal. This was not a story of dominance, not of control. It was one of balance. The star burned steadily. The planet received. Each orbit reinforced the connection. Each rotation carved new patterns on the surface below. What had once been chaos was now delicate structure. And though nothing had yet taken breath or voice, the groundwork for life was quietly being laid. This was the age of harmony. No voices spoke. No eyes watched. And yet, if you could float in that space and observe the motion, you might feel it too. The quiet grace of an orbit that never failed. A relationship built entirely on trust. For now, that was enough. The star needed nothing. The planet asked for nothing. But the bond between them was growing stronger with every passing year. Every cycle, every beam of light that reached the turning surface. This was not chance. This was not chaos. This was the beginning of something rare, and though neither star nor planet knew it yet, what they had started would echo long beyond their lifespans, into silence, into memory, into the kind of story the universe rarely gets to tell. Time in the universe does not march forward, it drifts. It flows like a slow, endless tide, reshaping everything it touches. And as the star continued to shine, time wrapped itself around its planets, pulling them through epochs that no eye would ever see. Billions of years passed, and yet, within that expanse, nothing seemed rushed. The star remained steady, pulsing with quiet fire. Its light, golden and constant, poured outward in every direction. It did not burn with fury. It glowed with purpose. And the world closest to it, the one that had held its orbit from the beginning, continued to turn beneath that warming gaze. This planet had changed, not through sudden moments, but through slow transformations, so subtle, only time itself could measure them. What had once been barren rock was now a canvas of movement and texture. Winds carved ridges into stone. Rains fell and rose in cycles. Rivers emerged, vanishing into valleys and reappearing as lakes. Mountains grew, inch by inch, from deep pressure within the planet's core. They pushed upward over millions of years, as if reaching toward the light that had always fed them. Clouds formed in the sky, not in chaos, but in rhythm. Storms danced across the surface like seasonal breath, never too much, never too still. Golden light filtered through those clouds with softness. The star's energy, consistent and patient, gave the world warmth, but not fire, motion, but not destruction. It was balance, delicate, powerful, quiet, and the planet responded. Its surface settled into seasons. Winters were gentle, blanketing the land with calm. Summers whispered heat across plains and peaks. There were no sharp edges anymore, only curves shaped by repetition. The atmosphere had thickened, now capable of holding the warmth like a blanket wrapped around a child. This world had become something more than just rock and motion. It had become a rhythm. Day and night flowed like waves. Each sunrise was a gentle reminder of the bond that held the sky in place. Each sunset was a soft promise that the light would return. And so, the days of harmony began, not marked by calendars, but by the quiet certainty of repetition. The planet breathed now, in patterns shaped by gravity and heat. Its oceans, formed from countless collisions and slow condensation, rolled calmly across its surface. They caught the star's light and threw it back in shimmering patterns, glittering proof that warmth had found a home. Land rose above those waters, not in jagged chaos, but in sculpted beauty. Forests did not yet grow. No creatures moved across the ground. But the potential was there, sleeping in the soil, waiting in the chemistry of the air. Life was still a whisper on the wind, but the stage was set above. The sky had cleared. The atmosphere no longer choked on volcanic ash or raw gas. Instead, it filtered light gently, painting the heavens in soft hues, blue in the day, violet at dusk, stars at night. The surface of the planet turned beneath this dome like a dancer. Beneath a spotlight, and always, the star watched. It had no eyes, no mind, but its presence never wavered. Its light never ceased. It burned with the same rhythm it had from the beginning, unaware of the change it had inspired. It simply gave, constantly, faithfully, without demand. The seasons came and went. The planet leaned gently on its axis, allowing for variation. Certain places warmed more than others. Poles grew icy, then thawed, then froze again. Equators basked in longer days, but everything remained in balance. This was not the chaos of birth. This was the peace of maturity. Continents drifted slowly, gliding atop molten currents deep below. Earthquakes reshaped coastlines, not with violence, but with quiet force. The planet aged with dignity, and the star, like a guardian standing just close enough to protect, yet far enough to allow freedom, simply continued to shine. There were no civilizations yet, no voices, no names. But if the universe had kept records, this would be marked as the Golden Age, when silence met symmetry, and the bond between star and world reached its purest form. In this harmony, the planet began to develop patterns, more complex than orbit. Tides swelled and retreated on a schedule shaped by invisible forces. Winds carved repeating shapes into sand. Ice grew in layers. Heat burrowed into soil. Everything followed cycles. And the more those cycles repeated, the more stable the world became. Volcanic plains cooled into fertile basins. Craters filled with water. Dust settled into layers, and those layers held history, even if no one was yet alive to read them. The planet was writing its own memory, silently, patiently, one grain at a time. Above, the star never changed course. It pulsed, with the same light. Its surface flared with occasional bursts of energy, but even those were controlled. Solar winds danced outward, brushing gently against the planet's magnetic field. The field held strong, shielding the surface, absorbing the storm with a quiet, invisible strength. And so the relationship deepened. Though they could not speak, their connection was absolute. The star gave energy. The planet transformed it. And through this exchange, stability was born. Not a moment of peace, but an era of it, lasting for eons. From a distance, it would look almost static. Nothing dramatic. No explosions, no collapse. Just a world turning in golden light, again and again, over uncountable centuries. But up close, the beauty was astonishing. Every shadow was carefully cast. Every sunrise painted a new angle. Every breeze, every reflection on the ocean's face, every shifting cloud, all were part of a larger, unspoken dance. It was not choreographed. It was natural. It was inevitable, and it was perfect. The star remained indifferent, but indifference can still be consistent. And in that consistency, the planet found what it needed most. Time. Time to evolve. Time to shape. Time to become. The surface now held more than shapes. It held energy, stored in the soil, held in the air. The chemistry of life was gathering. The ingredients were nearly ready. And still, the star poured its warmth across the world. Without question, harmony had become habit. From orbit, you could see the planet's blue oceans circling brown and green land. You could watch its clouds form and dissolve. You could sense the steady pulse of light, heating one side while the other cooled in night. And always, the same star, steady, golden, humming with nuclear fire, sat at the center of it all, like a keeper of time, never leaving its post. It didn't control the planet. It didn't shape its choices. It simply provided the one thing that could never be created from within: continuity. And so, across the billion-year breath of calm, a quiet truth settled in. This world had found a guardian, not one that spoke or intervened, but one that remained, that endured. In the end, it was this endurance that made harmony possible. Without it, the planet would have frozen, or burned, or drifted into oblivion. But with it, everything found a place, everything found a rhythm, and the universe, vast and uncaring, allowed this tiny piece of it to remain still, just long enough for the next chapter to begin. The light had never wavered before. For billions of years, it had remained steady, warm, golden, dependable. The star had shone like a silent promise, unchanged, through the drift of time. The planet knew nothing but this rhythm. Day and night, light and shadow, warmth and rest. The balance had felt eternal, but nothing in the universe truly stays the same. The change didn't come with a sound. It didn't come with violence. It arrived like a breath held too long, soft, almost invisible, but undeniable once noticed. The first shift was in the light. Not a dimming, not a flicker, just a difference. The star's brightness, once pure and smooth, now carried faint pulses, as if something deep inside had begun to tremble. The beams that reached the planet were still warm, still golden, but now, if one looked closely, they seemed just slightly, uneven, not weaker, but less constant. The difference was microscopic, but real. The planet felt it. The oceans, once moving in graceful tides, began to shift in unpredictable ways. Not violently, not immediately, but the patterns became less clean. Tides rose higher in some places, currents ran longer in others. The sea, which had followed the same rhythm for millennia, began to feel unsettled in the atmosphere. The change was harder to see, but easier to sense. Winds that once moved in predictable paths now drifted slightly off course. Temperatures began to vary, just a little, in places where they had always remained stable. The air, once thick and balanced, began to thin at the upper edges. Pressure dropped ever so slightly. It was not enough to harm, but enough to hint, enough to suggest that something above was different. The star, for all its grandeur, was beginning to age. It did not collapse, it did not erupt, but within its core, reactions were shifting. The hydrogen that had fueled it for eons was beginning to run low. In response, its core compressed. Heat increased, and the outer layers began to expand, not enough to be seen yet, but enough to affect the light it gave. The planet had no words for this, but it responded. Clouds formed more quickly now. Rain came harder in some regions, slower in others. The seasons stretched. Summers grew slightly warmer, winters slightly longer. The timing of everything began to drift, as if the planet itself was hesitating in its ancient dance. Mountains stood still, but the valleys echoed with a different silence. Forests, those new, fragile children of soil and time, swayed with less certainty. Leaves curled a little sooner. Flowers waited longer to bloom. The harmony was still present, but fraying at the edges, and the star, still unaware, still unconcerned, continued to burn. But its rhythm was no longer perfect. Small flares burst from its surface now, tiny storms of plasma that hurled particles into space. Most were caught by the planet's magnetic shield, but not all. Some slipped through, charged energy, brushing the upper atmosphere, causing momentary flickers in the sky. Aurorae, that had once been rare, now shimmered more often, like silent signals of unrest. Animals, primitive, silent, instinctive, felt the shift in their own way. Migration patterns changed. Sleep cycles altered. Behavior turned cautious. Life didn't understand the cause. It only felt the effect. And beneath the soil, deep in layers of stone, shaped by ancient pressure, tension began to rise. Tectonic plates moved more aggressively. Earthquakes, once rare, began to tremble more frequently beneath mountain ranges and ocean floors. Nothing catastrophic, not yet. But the planet was restless. It had lived in perfect rhythm for so long, it had grown used to certainty. The stars' changes, though small, were enough to wake something deep within, a quiet alertness, a subtle question forming inside the crust, inside the oceans, inside the air. Is the balance breaking? From space, nothing looked different. The stars still glowed. The planet still turned. The orbits were intact. The light still bathed the world in golden fire. But look closer, and you'd see the tension building. Not in drama, not in disaster, but in detail. The harmony had cracks now. Birds nested earlier. Insects emerged later. Winds began to cross paths that had been unchanged for millions of years. Deserts grew slightly wider. Glaciers, holding ancient, cold, melted at the edges and reformed with uneven shape. The planet was trying to adapt, but the changes were not done. The star's surface had become more active. Sunspots, once rare, now appeared more often. They shifted the star's brightness in tiny cycles, creating brief pulses in radiation. None were dangerous yet, but they marked something important. Instability. The star was still beautiful, still vast, still bright, but it had begun the slow journey from youth to old age. It had passed its peak. The burn was still strong, but now it came at a cost. Fuel was harder to find inside its core. The fusion that had once been effortless was now a deeper struggle, and the planet, unknowingly tied to every beat of that internal shift, felt each tremor through the life it hosted. Storm systems grew more complex. The jet streams, high above the ground, wandered off path. Rainforests received less moisture. The poles began to warm. A gentle mist of confusion settled over ecosystems that had lived in balance for thousands of generations. Still, life endured. The planet was resilient. It adjusted where it could. But beneath the surface, beneath the winds and water, the tension continued to rise. And in that tension, a new tone entered the story. It wasn't fear, not yet, but it was no longer comfort, either. It was anticipation, the kind that comes just before a change you cannot define. A sense that something is approaching, something you cannot stop. And still, the star gave its light. Not by choice, but by nature. It did not know what it was becoming. It only followed the laws written deep within its burning heart. It was not cruel. It was not careless. It was aging, and in that aging, its relationship with the world it had nurtured was shifting. The planet orbited still. It had not wavered, but the path no longer felt timeless. Each revolution now carried a slight difference, a longer summer, a stronger tide, a harder storm, and for the first time in its long, quiet existence, the world that once moved in perfect peace began to wonder, how long could this harmony last? It had no answer, only motion, only memory, and above, the star pulsed a little louder now, a little less even, whispering through its changes that time was moving forward, and the golden days were slowly slipping into something new. The change could no longer hide. For ages, the star had burned with quiet dignity. golden, balanced, steady. But deep within its heart, something irreversible had begun. The fuel that had powered it for billions of years was nearing exhaustion. The core, where fusion once happened smoothly, had become dense, heavy, collapsing under its own gravity. And in that collapse, something ancient stirred. The star, once small and controlled, began to respond. It didn't crack or explode. It swelled, slowly, relentlessly. Its outer layers, once held tight by internal pressure, began to stretch outward. The hydrogen at its edges ignited again, now in new and unstable zones. As fresh fusion took hold in the outer shells, the star expanded its size, growing day by day, almost imperceptibly at first, then unmistakably. The planet, still spinning faithfully in its orbit, didn't feel heat like a flame. It felt light, deeper, redder, heavier. The skies, once blue and soft with scattered light, began to turn. The atmosphere thickened with unfamiliar particles. The sky no longer opened with gentle morning gold. It bled in shades of crimson. Dusk arrived earlier. Dawn burned slower. Even at midday, the light seemed darker, not in brightness, but in tone. The sun had changed color. Where it once glowed gold, it now burned red. A dull, massive presence in the sky, swollen far beyond its original size. The planet's orbit had not changed, but the distance had shrunk, not by movement, but by growth. The star was coming closer, not because it moved, but because it expanded. From the ground, the change was undeniable. Shadows stretched longer. Temperatures rose. The seasons lost their balance. Winters shortened. Summers deepened. The soil dried faster. Water evaporated more easily. Insects vanished from forests. Birds flew earlier and returned later, disoriented by the light they no longer recognized. And in the silence of that confusion, the planet continued to turn. It was still alive, still rich with rivers and wind and motion. But the harmony was cracking. The balance, once so perfect, was slipping. And above, the red giants swelled. Storms became violent now, not from water, but from heat. Deserts expanded. Ice caps melted with speed. Entire ecosystems shifted. The oceans began to boil at their edges. The surface baked in places that once held forests. Life was not yet ending, but it was retreating. Struggling, forced into corners. The planet had been a child of the star, fed by its warmth. But now the parent had grown too large, too hot, too close. The star's size was now hundreds of times what it once was. From the planet's surface, it filled half the sky. At sunrise, it rose not as a sphere, but as a massive, burning wall. At sunset, it did not sink, it hovered, glowing red against the horizon for hours, refusing to let darkness fall. The nights were shorter, the stars dimmer, the heat inescapable. Even in orbit, the change could be seen clearly. Satellites, once quiet in their circuits, now baked in radiation. Their solar panels warped, their instruments flickered. Communication became unreliable. The planet's upper atmosphere, once a shield, began to thin under the pressure of constant solar wind. It was no longer just heat. It was exposure. Radiation levels climbed. The magnetic field, stretched and bent, began to let more through. Particles rained down into the skies. Auroras danced wildly, not just at the poles, but across the entire planet. Not as beauty, but as warning. And still, the star swelled. It had entered the red giant phase, completely now. Its outer layers billowed like smoke, its surface roiling with slow motion, storms of fire. Prominences arced outward, loops of plasma larger than the planet itself, before falling back in slow, majestic collapse. To the planet below, the sun no longer felt like a giver. It felt like a threat. Forests withered under constant heat. Lakes shrank into salt beds. Rain came rarely, and when it did, it came all at once, violent, destructive, desperate. Species moved toward the poles, seeking cooler air. Others vanished entirely. The delicate threads of ecosystems began to snap. The planet's surface turned brittle in places, cracked in others. Tectonic activity increased, not because the core had changed, but because the outer shell had become fragile, pressured from above and below. And all the while, the red star glowed, unaware. Its expansion was not rage. It was inevitability. This was the path written into every star from the moment of ignition. Birth, growth, stability, then swelling, aging, collapse. It was not cruelty. It was nature. But for the planet, that truth meant little. Its orbit, once safe and wide, now brought it dangerously close to the outer edges of the star's growing body. Each year, the space between narrowed. Each season, the heat grew stronger. There was no way to move, no choice to flee. The planet had no engines, no warning systems. It only had its path drawn by gravity, followed since the beginning, and so it continued to turn as the red fire grew closer. The days were unbearably hot now, not just in numbers, but in pressure. Light pushed on everything. Rocks shimmered, air shimmered. Surfaces that once held snow now cracked open under blinding heat. The sky turned orange at noon. The clouds, when they formed, glowed from below. Animals retreated. Plants shrank. The world adapted, as best it could. But the threat could no longer be ignored. The bond that once nourished the planet now threatened to consume it. The star loomed like a slow-moving tide, rising not in speed but in certainty. Each orbit, the planet brushed closer to the edge of that expanding surface. Each revolution, the pull grew stronger. Not just gravity, heat, radiation, force. And yet, there was no panic, no chaos. The world did not scream. It simply moved forward, carrying everything it had known, everything it had built, around the orbit one more time. Its skies burned red. Its oceans steamed. But it turned, because that's all it knew. There was something tragic in its loyalty, and something beautiful in its endurance. Above, the red giant pulsed, a giant heart made of fire, nearing the end of its rhythm. It would not last forever. One day, it would collapse, shedding its outer layers, shrinking into a cold white ember. But that day had not come yet. For now, the danger was still growing. The distance between life and destruction was shrinking. The space that had once been safe had become a narrowing gap, and soon, the planet would cross the line it could not return from. But not yet. It still had one more orbit, one more year, one more turn beneath the burning sky. And in that motion, slow, inevitable, the bond continued, not as warmth, but as warning, not as life, but as memory, beginning to write its final lines. The sky had never looked so close. The red star loomed larger now, swollen and burning like a horizon that never ended. Where once it had floated gently in the sky, a soft golden sphere of life, it now pressed into the heavens, flooding the planet's air with an intensity too great to bear. It did not roar. It did not chase. It simply existed. Too close, too massive, too inevitable. Gravity, silent and patient, had begun to tighten its grip. The planet's orbit, once perfectly balanced, had shifted, not in a dramatic fall, not in a spiral, but in the quiet way that only time can measure. The path had dipped, slightly. The distance narrowed. The invisible tether between world and star had begun to pull harder. The planet tried to hold its place. It spun, as it always had. It leaned with its axis, carried its atmosphere, turned its face again and again toward the light. It moved forward, following the same track it had followed since the beginning. But now, the track was bending. The light was heavier. The space it passed through each day felt tighter, more intense, more strained. Its oceans, still vast, had begun to retreat from the heat. Currents slowed. Evaporation surged. The atmosphere swelled with vapor and heat. Rain no longer came in patterns. It came in floods or not at all. The land cracked. The poles melted. Clouds thickened with chemical haze. But the planet refused to break. Somewhere, in its endless rhythm, there was resistance. Not defiance, but loyalty. It had never left. Even as the star changed, even as the heat grew cruel, the planet remained in its place, turning, trusting, hoping. It wanted to stay, not with words, not with thought, but with action, with orbit, with presence. Even now, it circled the star, like a child, reaching for a memory, like a friend, unwilling to leave a fading companion. The red giant burned without care. Its body was a bloated mass of heat and plasma. Its solar winds had become waves. Its outer edges brushed space with streams of radiation that battered the planet's magnetic field. Still, the planet turned, but the pull was growing stronger. Gravity, once gentle, had become relentless. The swelling of the star had not changed, its mass, but the outer layers it threw into space shifted the planet's trajectory. Drag increased. Resistance grew. The planet was being pulled inward, not in a fall, but in a surrender. Its orbit decayed by fractions, by invisible degrees. But over time, those fractions became everything. The planet's path dipped closer to the star. The days grew shorter. The nights were nearly gone. The heat never left. Even at what used to be midnight, the horizon glowed. Red. Shadows vanished. Darkness became memory. Forests turned to ash. Lakes became plains of steam. The sky thickened with chemical storms. Life, once spread across the planet, now shrank into isolated pockets, deep underground, beneath thick oceans, clinging to the last safe corners of a dying surface. And still, the planet stayed. Not because it could, but because it would not let go. There was something haunting in its devotion, a world that refused to abandon the star that had given it everything. Even as that giver transformed into a taker, the planet continued its turn. The star, of course, did not notice. It pulsed with unstable rhythm. Its outer shell flared in massive waves, loops of fire breaking away and falling back. Its light was no longer even. It came in bursts, in surges, in floods of radiation. It did not remember the golden age. It did not feel guilt. It simply expanded, as all stars do in their final years. The planet shook. Tectonic plates buckled under atmospheric pressure. Earthquakes tore through once stable ground. Volcanoes returned. Magma flowed near the surface. The crust groaned like something ancient waking from a dream. Everything was shifting. And above, the red fire crept closer. It now filled 3/4 of the sky. The horizon, once distant and blue, was now a curtain of flame. The atmosphere was changing its composition, overwhelmed by heat, split apart by radiation. The air thinned in places, thickened in others. Breathing for anything still alive became difficult, then dangerous. Still, the orbit held. Not perfectly, not proudly, but persistently. The planet resisted the fall with all. It had its momentum fought the pull. Centrifugal force pushed outward even as gravity pulled inward. It was not a battle. It was a goodbye stretched over centuries, and in that slow farewell, something beautiful lingered. The planet did not crumble. It did not surrender in panic. It adapted. It changed. It held the memory of every rotation, every sunrise, every storm. That had once been gentle. It carried the silence of oceans now gone, the whispers of winds no longer heard, the footprints of life fading from its crust. It remembered, because the star could not, and perhaps that was the difference between them. The red giant swelled again, another flare, another shedding of heat into space. The planet's orbit wavered. The decay had reached its tipping point. The next pass would bring it dangerously close to the star's outermost layers. And still, the planet turned. It was not ready to leave. It had never known another home, never sought distance, never questioned the bond that pulled it. It did not resist out of fear. It resisted out of loyalty, even as gravity pulled harder, even as the orbit tightened like a noose. The planet held on, but physics has no pity. Motion obeys mass. Gravity obeys density. And the star, vast, burning, collapsed at its center, now ruled everything near it with absolute force. The planet's orbit dipped further. It was no longer circular. It was now elliptical, dipping dangerously inward, before swinging back out, only to be caught again, lower each time. There would not be many more turns. The bond had become a trap, and yet, even in that trap, there was beauty. The planet's skies, red and gold, choked but glowing still, reflected the star's light. Its mountains, scarred and broken, still cast shadows across crumbling plains. Somewhere, deep beneath the surface, heat still flowed, slow and steady, like memory itself, because even in death, it remembered life. The star would never know what it meant to be held, to be trusted, to be loved, but the planet did. It had known warmth. It had known light, not as threat, but as gift, and for as long as it could, it would orbit. One more year, one more sunrise, one more turn, even as it was pulled closer, even as the fire reached out, even as the bond became a final embrace, because that's what gravity is, not just pull, but longing, and some worlds would rather burn than let go. The orbit had become fragile. What was once a smooth, endless path had bent inward like a wilting stem. The planet no longer moved in a circle. Its final revolutions curved dangerously close to the edge of the red star's bloated atmosphere. The motion was still there, the spin, the path, the rhythm, but it had slowed, not by force, by surrender. The sky was no longer a place of comfort. It was filled now with a sun that did not rise. It arrived, fully present, already massive, already burning. There was no dawn anymore, only exposure. The horizon held no mystery. The red glow touched everything at once, flooding the land with a light that no longer felt alive. Time had stretched. Each hour dragged like a breath held too long. Each rotation of the planet took more from it, more air, more water, more memory. The surface cracked in long, dry sighs. The oceans had mostly vanished, leaving behind vast salt plains and shallow, steaming lakes that boiled in silence. The days were no longer days. They were events. Each one felt like a chapter closing, the final light on a mountain range that would never see another shadow, the last gust of wind through a dead forest, the last ripple across a quiet shore. Every motion seemed stretched, every sound faded faster, and in this slow decay, silence grew. The winds that once carved valleys now moved in stillness. No rustling of leaves, no crashing of waves. Even the storms had gone quiet. The planet was listening now, not to the sky, not to the stars, but inward, to the echoes within itself. The core still spun, the crust still cracked, but the world had grown quiet in its final turns. Above it all, the red star swelled. It was no longer just large. It was close, uncomfortably close. Its outer edges reached into space like waves of breathless fire, brushing the edges of the planet's weakening atmosphere. It pulsed slowly, like a massive heart nearing the end of its beat. The orbit tightened again. The planet passed through heat that scraped the upper sky. The blue had turned to brown, then gray. Now it was red, a permanent haze that tinted every surface, every stone, every broken tree. The clouds were gone. Moisture could no longer rise. Rain had ended long ago, and yet the planet still turned. It turned without promise, without future. Not out of habit, but out of memory. It knew nothing else. Even as it decayed, it remained loyal to the motion that had birthed it. Around and around it went, slower, weaker. Fading dark shadows had disappeared. There was no longer a clear line between light and dark. The star's size filled too much of the sky for night to fall. The planet bathed in an eternal red dusk, where the glow never ended. Darkness, once a time of rest, had become extinct. The animals were gone. Life had retreated long ago into deep caverns, into cracks beneath mountains, into the last places the fire could not reach. And now, even those places were vanishing. Heat seeped down. Pressure rose. Silence claimed what life could not defend. Still, the crust held on. It broke in places, folded in others, but it held. It resisted collapse with the same dignity it had carried for eons. And on its fractured skin, there were still signs, dried riverbeds like veins, mountain shadows like scars, craters that held the memory of time, and all around, the red sky watched. The sun did not scream. It simply glowed, vast and cruel in its beauty. Its light no longer nourished. It erased, it bleached, it scorched, but in that erasure, it wrote something deeper, a closing chapter no one would read, but that mattered all the same. The orbit had nearly reached its end. One more revolution, maybe two, not more. The planet could feel it. The heat had changed. It was no longer distant, no longer filtered. It was direct now, pressing down with a weight that the atmosphere could not hold back. The final days arrived without fanfare. No explosion, no thunder. Just pressure, just silence. The land gave up its last breath. The winds stopped. Even the core cooled, ever so slightly, as if understanding what was to come. The spin remained, but it stuttered, not with failure, but with weariness. And then came the last light. Not different in color, not brighter, just final. It struck the mountains, the valleys, the hollow plains, one last time, as if blessing them before they were gone. The glow touched the edges of memory and paused, not because the star knew, but because the moment did. The planet continued to turn, no matter how slow, no matter how broken. One last orbit, one last dance around the flame it had always loved. It did not resist, it did not run. It circled, closer, slower, quieter. The horizon, once distant, had now risen into the sky itself. The red giant had expanded past the limits, once thought unreachable. Its outer shell brushed space like a veil, and the planet, bound by gravity, was already inside it. Not fully, not swallowed, but touched. Its atmosphere scraped by solar wind, its surface bathed in particles, its magnetic field peeled back like fragile skin, and still, it turned. There was no ceremony, no sound, just motion, just gravity, still pulling, still tying, still holding. The final orbit was not a fall, it was a return, a completion. The planet, in its last breath, did not collapse. It remembered. The harmony, the golden light, the soft rain, the slow birth of life, the mountains that grew, the rivers that ran, the sky that once danced with clouds, the star that once gave warmth instead of fire. And in that memory, it circled one last time, not in defeat, but in grace. The final orbit completed not with fire, but with silence. Not with screams, but with stillness. Not with rage, but with reverence. Because even as the end drew near, the planet honored the bond that had defined its life. And the red star pulsed overhead, not knowing, not mourning, only burning. And the world below quietly turned no more. There was no impact, no explosion, no thunder in the sky. When the planet touched the star, it wasn't a collision. It was an arrival, soft, slow, inevitable. The red giant's outer layers, swollen and hot, had already reached out far beyond their former boundaries. The planet's final orbit skimmed just beneath those burning folds, like a feather brushing fire, at first. There was only light, not the golden warmth of ages past, but a heavy, glowing red that covered everything. The sky's bled color. The atmosphere shimmered, then trembled, then vanished. The shield that had protected life for billions of years was the first to go, peeled away by solar wind, too strong, too constant. Without its barrier, the planet stood bare beneath its parent star. Oceans already diminished, boiled upward in enormous columns of vapor. Lakes hissed and disappeared. Moisture left the surface not as storms, but as silence, rising in ghostly clouds, lost to space. What had once been seas, homes, memories, now evaporated in a final offering. And still, there was no violence. There was no scream, no shatter. The planet did not erupt. It softened. Its crust, once hard and marked with time, began to glow, not from fire within, but from heat without. Mountains slumped, valleys filled. Stone turned to liquid, slowly, gently. It did not crack. It flowed. This was not death by force. This was surrender by heat. The star did not pull the planet inward, like prey. It accepted it, gradually, like a long-lost child stepping closer to an open embrace. The gravity that once held them apart now held them together. The difference between atmosphere and surface dissolved, from above. It looked like a dance. The planet, glowing from its edges, circled through plasma and flame. Each rotation pulled it deeper. Each turn stripped away another layer of crust, of atmosphere, of identity. It was not torn apart. It was unmade, one motion at a time. The magnetic field collapsed. Next, with the atmosphere gone, there was no longer enough energy to sustain protection. Charged particles flooded the surface. Radiation tore through empty skies. The planet, for the first time in its long life, stood exposed. And yet, it kept turning. Even as it sank into the star's corona, the vast, glowing outer shell of red fire, the planet turned. It spun, as it always had, as if refusing to forget what it once was. The heat grew unbearable. Rock melted. Continents disappeared beneath waves of molten flow, but the core still held deep beneath the surface. Beneath the fire and the ash and the silence, the iron heart of the planet endured. It spun, slightly slower now, but still turning, still remembering. The stars surrounded it, layer after layer of hydrogen and helium lit by fusion. Temperatures surged to millions of degrees, but the planet did not scream. It did not shatter into fragments. It folded inward, quietly, softly. There was something deeply sad in the moment, not because it was unfair, but because it was time. This was not destruction. This was a return. The planet had been born from the dust of a collapsed star, billions of years ago. Its elements had once burned in other suns. And now, it had come full circle, not to die, but to be reabsorbed. Its minerals, its gases, its memories, all were drifting now into the larger body of the red giant, diffusing, dissolving, blending. From a distance, it looked like nothing at all, a faint flicker, a pulse, a momentary swirl in the vast burning field. No screams, number, witnesses, just flame. But if you had stood on that world, in its final seconds, you would have felt something no telescope could ever see. Peace, because it was not afraid. The world had lived a full life. It had felt warmth. It had known oceans and storms, forests and sky. It had hosted life. It had held seasons. It had turned, again and again, around the same sun that now held it in flame. Its journey was complete. The final crust slid into fire. The final rocks breaking apart into plasma. No trace remained. No shell, no soil. The atmosphere was gone. The surface dissolved. But the memory lingered, held in gravity, in light, in the silent shape the orbit once carved. The red giant pulsed it. Did not mourn. It simply grew a little brighter, not because of power, but because something familiar had returned. The mass of the planet, absorbed into the outer shell, added to its light, fused into its rhythm, became part of its fire, and in that fire, The planet was not forgotten. It was made whole. There is a silence the universe holds, a quiet that surrounds endings. It doesn't cry. It doesn't celebrate. It remembers through gravity, through energy, through the soft pulling of mass into mass. The planet, though erased, was now part of something greater. The star had not devoured it. It had received it. And somewhere, in that fusion, in those rising waves of nuclear flame, was the echo of everything the planet once was: oceans, dust, breath, stone. It lived again, not as a world, but as light, and that light would travel far through the blackness, across stars, beyond time. Perhaps one day, in another corner of the cosmos, those photons would strike a world of their own. Perhaps life would look up and feel warmth, never knowing it once came from a world that no longer spins. But the universe would know, because no orbit is ever wasted. No light ever truly ends. It only changes form, and as the star settled once more, its outer layers absorbing the final wisps of the planet, it had raised a calm silence stretched outward. There was no grief. There was only completion, not a death, but a return, not an end, but a beginning of something else. And in that slow, burning heart, the planet remained. The planet was gone. Nothing of its shape remained. But not everything had disappeared. Small fragments still floated in the orbit where it once turned, bits of crust, metallic dust, vaporized minerals. They didn't form a solid ring immediately. At first, it was just a halo of scattered debris, stretching loosely along the path the planet had followed for billions of years. There was no force left to hold them together, no gravity from a planetary core, no magnetosphere. The particles simply lingered, trapped by the weak gravity of the aging star. They drifted slowly, pulled into a loose, circular motion that echoed the orbit the planet once held with precision. Over time, the debris began to settle. Dust spiraled inward. Heavier fragments stabilized. The trail began to narrow and align, shaped by the star's rotation and by the patterns left behind in space. What formed was a faint ring, thin, uneven, but unmistakable. A boundary of memory, suspended in silence. It did not glow brightly. It had no color that stood out, but it moved. Every fragment, every particle, every shattered trace of the world followed the same path, circling slowly, quietly. Like ashes left on the wind, they didn't fall, they hovered, they drifted, they remained. No signal came from them, no heat, no voice. But from a distance, if someone had looked close enough, they would have seen the curve, a faded outline, an orbit around a star, no longer young. The star, too, had changed. It was smaller now. Its red fire had cooled. The fusion that once surged through its body had slowed to a crawl. But inside, pressure remained enough to keep it alive, enough to keep it glowing. It was not dead, only dimmed. Its spectrum had shifted. The light it cast into space carried new traces, a faint presence of heavier elements that had not been there before. Spectrographs would show iron signatures where none had existed. Carbon lines appeared in places where only helium used to be. There was oxygen, magnesium, silicon, the bones of a planet now written into light. The star had absorbed more than mass. It had taken in a history, and now that history moved with it, not in memory, but in measurable wavelengths. The star spoke without sound, and what it said was simple. Something once lived here. Even light passing through the ring changed slightly. As photons from the star filtered through the orbiting dust, they bent, slowed, scattered. The ring left shadows, not dark enough to see with the eye, but present in the data. A shadow that marked a loss. That loss was quiet. Nothing in the universe paused. Other stars continued to burn. Galaxies spun undisturbed. There were no alarms, no record keepers. But in this corner of space, one world had ended, and space, in its stillness, acknowledged that in the way only space could, by preserving the trail, Debris floated like a cemetery of motion. No monuments stood. No stones were carved. But every fragment in the ring carried the story. Some had once been part of mountains. Others had formed the ocean floor. A few, perhaps, had rested beneath a sky and felt rain. Now they moved in silence, orbiting a star. That had taken everything but not quite forgotten. Time passed. The ring thickened slightly. More dust settled into its shape. The inner edge became smoother. The outer curve bent more tightly. Even without a planet to hold it, the debris found its place. Motion, not will, gave it order. Gravity, not memory, made it stay. But the result was the same. A structure formed, where loss had occurred. No spacecraft crossed this region. No signals passed through. But if they ever did, if a probe one day arrived and scanned the star, it would find something strange in the data. The light would read wrong. The star's size would not match its age. The orbiting dust would confuse its temperature. The spectrograph would carry too many stories for one object. Because the star no longer stood alone, it carried weight. It carried residue. It carried grief, not as emotion, but as imbalance. Slight, measurable, undeniable. Cosmic grief doesn't cry. It lingers. It shows up in the way a ring never quite disperses, in the way a spectrum carries too many fingerprints, in the way a magnetic field twists at an angle that no longer makes sense. The universe doesn't speak in words. It speaks in drift, in residue, in rings. And this ring stayed. It was not bright. It was not strong. But it was there. Every rotation of the star beneath it stirred the dust. Every flare of heat pushed particles outward, only for them to return. The debris didn't fall inward. It didn't escape. It hovered balanced perfectly at the edge of being remembered. The silence wasn't empty. There was a density to this place, even in vacuum. A pressure, a presence. The kind of stillness that holds meaning even without form. If someone had stood there, if somehow, through time or fate, a future being arrived in orbit, they would feel it, not physically, but deeply. The ring was not beautiful, but it was honest. It didn't try to be more than what it was. It didn't carry light. It didn't reflect glory. It was just the leftover pieces of something once whole. Still moving, still orbiting, still tied to the star that had ended it. And in that orbit, it told the truth. The truth that even stars end stories. The truth that even stars carry regret. Written not in thoughts, but in elements. The truth that even in destruction, something always remains. No sound moved here. No heat, no wind. Just the faint friction of dust crossing dust. Particles rubbing softly in vacuum. Each one once part of a place where rain fell and leaves swayed. The light from the star dimmed a little more. It would keep shining for millions of years. But its pulse had slowed. Its edges cooled. Its spectrum quieted. But the ring remained. The orbit stayed. The debris circled with discipline, like it was still answering to a planet no longer there. Even in loss, motion continued. Even in silence, presence remained. And so the remains whispered, not in sound, not in waves, but in orbit, in dust, in fragments. And the star, beneath it all, carried on. Not alone. The years passed without record. There was no countdown, no event marker, no witness to track the change. But time moved forward as it always does, steadily, silently, without permission. And with it, the star continued its transformation. It had lost its size. The once bloated red giant had shed its outer layers long ago. Those gases, now stretched thin across the vacuum, were barely visible, faint clouds drifting into the galactic dark. What remained was a core, hot, dense, and small. The star had become a white dwarf. It no longer burned with the intensity of fusion. It glowed instead, not because it was alive, but because it was still cooling. The heat trapped inside, once enough to light an entire solar system, now seeped outward like warmth from cooling metal. The outer ring of planetary dust was still in place. Over time, most of the lighter particles had been pushed away or drawn into distant orbits. What remained was a thin disk, fainter, slower, but consistent. It followed the same path again and again, as if continuing an old habit that no longer served a purpose. The space around the white dwarf was quiet. No solar wind, no violent flares, no strong gravitational shifts, just silence, deep, thick, unchanging. The surrounding vacuum had settled. No new planets formed. No moons orbited. The system had entered a state of permanent stillness. Inside the white dwarf, atomic pressure had created a strange kind of matter. The core was compressed beyond anything a planet could experience. Atoms were crushed together, electrons packed tightly. There was no fire, just heat, no motion, just memory. The glow it emitted was soft, even bluish-white. It pulsed faintly, not with life, but with time. From a distance, it looked peaceful, not like the sun that once blazed, not like the red giant that had swallowed its closest planet. This was different, smaller, colder, but strangely dignified. It did not demand attention. It existed, and that was enough. There was no sign of the planet anymore. Its dust had blended with the star's outer layers long ago. Its core elements, iron, carbon, magnesium, had been absorbed into the dwarf's mass. Nothing of its shape remained. No shell, no crust, no orbit. But its presence was still there. In the composition of the star, something had changed. Spectral. Lines had shifted. The elements within the dwarf didn't match a star that had evolved alone. It carried signatures from rock, from atmosphere, from biology, subtle traces that didn't belong, unless something else had once been part of it, and something had. The white dwarf now held the memory of that planet, not in thought or feeling, but in form. The materials that had once made rivers, trees, clouds, and living creatures were now embedded in its mass. The planet was no longer separate. It was fused with the star's body. That fusion brought a new stillness. There was nothing left to orbit, nothing to protect, nothing to hold. But the star itself had become the last monument, not a tombstone, but a vessel. It carried the weight of a world not as burden, but as conclusion. In its glow was history, even though no one remained to remember it. The white dwarf's light carried everything that came before. Photons left its surface slowly, traveling into empty space, and within those waves of light were traces of everything it had absorbed. Calm had replaced heat. Where once storms and eruptions marked the sky, now there was uniformity. The star no longer pulsed. It didn't flare. It didn't erupt. Its brightness faded slowly, evenly, like a breath that never rushed. The violent years were over. This was patience now. This was rest. It would take billions of years for the star to cool, completely dot. Eventually, it would become a black dwarf, a dark, cold sphere of collapsed matter. But that age was far off, almost beyond imagination. Until then, it would glow not brightly, but steadily, and through that steady light, it would speak not in words, not in signals, but in presence. It existed where something once lived, and that existence carried meaning. Whether seen or not, if one were to study the light closely, they would find the anomalies. Spectral readings would reveal too much carbon, too much oxygen, patterns that made no sense for a solitary star. And if someone looked close enough, if they had context, if they had time, they might see it. The ghost of a planet, hidden in the chemistry of a dying light. But the white dwarf didn't wait for discovery. It had no audience, no purpose beyond what it had become, and so it simply floated, surrounded by nothing, watched by no one. Its glow continued to fade. Its temperature dropped year by year. But even in that fading, it held something. Remarkable, it held completion. The journey had ended. The planet had returned to the star. The system had stilled. And now, The only movement left was cooling, the slow passage of time across a body that once lit the sky. There was a kind of beauty in that, not loud, not dramatic, just honest, the kind of beauty that doesn't need to be seen to matter. The white dwarf existed as proof that something had been here, and even though that proof couldn't speak, it didn't need to, because its presence was enough. It was quiet, it was still, and it was final. Long after the collapse had settled, long after the light had dimmed to a stable glow, only one thing remained constant. The star dot. It had once been one half of a system, the giver of warmth, the center of rotation. Now, it stood alone. No planets, no moons, no orbiting companions, just a single glowing remnant, spinning slowly in an unmarked corner of the galaxy. It hadn't meant to consume what orbited it. The process wasn't violent, not intentional. It had expanded over time, gradually, until its reach was too wide and its pull too strong. The planet hadn't fought back. It had simply drifted closer, unable to resist, until it was no longer a separate thing. Now, everything that once made that world distinct, the elements, the crust, the water, even the air, was part of the star, fused, burned, transformed, but it hadn't vanished completely. The data didn't lie. When astronomers from some future civilization scanned the star, they would find things that didn't make sense. Too much carbon, traces of nitrogen, oxygen levels higher than expected for a star of this type and age. The evidence would be subtle, but clear. Something else had once existed here, something that had not been born from fire. The rotation had changed, too. Before the event, the star had spun at a stable rate. After absorbing the planet, there was a shift, slight, but permanent. The additional mass had altered its inertia. The star now moved with a heavier rhythm, carrying the weight of everything it had consumed. From a distance, it looked normal, a white dwarf, isolated, cooling slowly. But to those who understood what had happened, this wasn't just any star. This was the one that had eaten its own world. There were no remains visible, no ring, no orbit, no satellite trail. The planet hadn't left behind a shell. It had been completely absorbed, layer by layer, until only light remained. No one would find ruins, no buried machines, no silent monuments, just a record hidden in the star's composition. But the loss had form, not physically, but in what was no longer there. An absence, a void where motion once existed. The silence of an orbit that had ended, the cooling of a body that had once supported life, now gone. For the star, the moment had passed. There was no awareness, no regret. Stars do not mourn. They continue, driven by gravity and fusion, bound by pressure and time. The white dwarf didn't remember what it had taken in, but the universe did, because every change leaves a trace. Photons left the star's surface, every second small packets of energy that had once passed through the heart of a living planet. Some of these photons had been shaped by matter from oceans, from trees, from clouds. Now, they carried those histories outward into space. The light traveled far. It crossed empty systems, past dead stars, slipped through nebulae. With each year, it spread wider, a slow, drifting echo of everything that had happened here. One day, perhaps, it would be intercepted. Perhaps a telescope would catch it. Perhaps someone would ask where this particular glow had come from, and someone might say, "That is the light from a star that ate its own world," because that's what it was now, not just a star, but a story, a system that had collapsed into itself, a bond that ended not with fire, but with gravity, a connection that held until there was nothing left to orbit. And even after that, it didn't break. It transformed. It was a quiet kind of legacy, not written in stone, not preserved in images, but carried in light, in motion, in the invisible pattern of particles still drifting outward from the collapse. What once burned for two, now burned alone. But that loneliness wasn't tragic. It was peaceful. The star didn't flare anymore. Its temperature continued to drop over time. Eventually, it would cool into darkness, a black dwarf, invisible in the void. But that fate was so far away it didn't matter yet. For now, it still glowed, soft, constant, present. No signals came from it. No civilizations called its name. But its silence wasn't emptiness. It was rest. The kind of silence that follows completion. The kind that only comes when something ends the way it was always meant to. In its final state, the star wasn't mourning. It was simply still. The light it cast no longer changed anything. It didn't support life. It didn't drive weather. It didn't power growth. But it continued anyway, because that's what stars do. They shine, whether anyone is there to see it or not. That was the closing truth. Not everything ends with noise. Not every inning is a crash or a burst. Some stories close with slow cooling, with silence, with motion that fades into nothing, and even then, something remains, not in form, but in memory. This star would not speak. It would not retell the story. But it didn't need to. The evidence was there, in the elements, in the energy, in the change, in every photon that left its surface. It was written not in language, but in light. Eventually, everything would move on. The debris would drift. The nearby space would quiet even more. No visitors would come. No one would orbit here again. But the star didn't ask for anything. It didn't wait. It simply remained. And that was enough. The planet had returned to its source. Not destroyed, just transformed. Not lost, just integrated. Not gone, just different. It was no longer a world. It was light now. And that light would continue. Somewhere, billions of years from now, someone might catch a fragment of it. A signal, a pulse, a photon. And maybe, just maybe, they would trace it back and realize something once happened here. And now, you float among them, in the story of stars.